Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Lara Friedman. I'm the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Today is Friday, October 22nd, and I am honored to have with me today on very, very short notice two esteemed colleagues from Israel and Palestine, Sarit Michael, who is the International Advocacy Officer of Btselem, the Israeli Human Rights Organization, and Ines Abdel Razek, who is the Advocacy Director for the Palestine Institute for Public Diplomacy, PIPD. And full bios will be posted along with this podcast, so I'm not going to go through them now. I asked Ines and Sarit to join me again on very short notice to talk about what today is huge and very alarming news out of Israel, which is the announcement that the Israeli Ministry of Defense has determined that it is declaring a group of human rights organizations to be terrorist organizations. And these are human rights defenders, effectively. And this is, I will quote a tweet I just saw from Israeli lawyer Michael Sfard, who called this, quote, a declaration of war on the entire human rights community. And I don't think he's overstating it. So Sarit, Ines, thank you for agreeing to join me on such notice. It's already very late on your side of the world, so we're going to dive right in. So Sarit, I want to start with you. Can you just very quickly talk in broad brushstrokes? This is for the crowd that is not expert on this. Talk about what happened today.
Well, today the announcement was made by the Ministry of Defense, Minister of Defense Benny Gantz, of his declaration of these 6 Palestinian human rights organizations as terror organizations. It was clearly organized in advance. I don't know why they chose a Friday to release it. It's the day off for us today. And the Ministry of Defense also released their PR people released like a dossier on each one of these organizations, including in 3 languages, Hebrew, Arabic, and English, including various accusations against each one of them, targeting them or declaring that these organizations are fronts, effectively, for the Palestinian, the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine. This came out at lunchtime, clearly a really shocking and first-time development for this kind of action against Palestinian human rights organizations. Israel very often declares various Palestinian groups to be terror organizations or illegal or unpermitted organizations, associations, but these kinds of human rights groups that have been, I should also say, smeared and harassed and attacked by the Israeli authorities and also by these Israeli government identified groups have never been placed on the terror register. This is effectively what they have done now. And this is clearly absolutely shocking action. I should just say right now, obviously, that I send my personal solidarity and obviously Btselem's solidarity to all of our colleagues in Palestinian organizations who are going to have to deal with this kind of official harassment and beyond harassment, of official hounding that has now gone up another level in terms of the ability of the authorities to use a whole range of tools in order to stop the actions, to stop the activities, and to harm these organizations.
Thanks. That's a great lead off. Ines, I want to come to you to talk about who the groups are involved in this, because we're talking about 6 specific groups, some of them extremely high profile. And I will say, I tweeted about this morning. This is a phenomenon I've long called. It has not gone viral. I don't know why, because it's so catchy. I call this 6 degrees of terrorist contamination, because what we're talking about here are groups that nobody, not even the Israeli government, is alleging are engaging in financing, supporting, inciting, really doing anything that actually relates to terrorism. They're basically saying, gotcha, we gotcha on some kind of technicality. So can you talk about the groups that are impacted by today's announcements?
Yes, it's a very tough day, and I've been speaking to friends and colleagues who work in these organizations, And I really want to say it's terrible, but unfortunately it's not new, and it's something that's just another level in the criminalization. And so yes, these organizations are prominent, NGOs or centers in Palestinian civil society. They work in different streams, whether it's agriculture and the rights of farmers, in women's rights, in documenting widely, Israel violations of international law and human rights, like Al-Haq, and many of them exist since the 70s. So we're not talking about also like new organizations that have emerged yesterday. And there are organizations that, I think are doing an essential job in actually trying to hold Israel to account and hold, and monitor and document the reality, which unfortunately is part of this process of criminalization. I think a big part of what is happening right now is obviously that these organizations feels like a threat to Israel, that is trying to hide and trying to get away with tremendous violence and illegality and unlawful practices in Palestine and even on the other side of the Green Line. So I think they're seen as a threat, and I think right now what Israel is saying is that they finally kind of are willing to criminalize them under Israeli law.
So, I mean, what you're saying, I mean, it's interesting. It sounds like what you're saying is that these groups are being targeted because they are effective in challenging Israeli policies, and this was the hook that is used. And I think that certainly stands up to what we've seen. If you look at the work for years of groups like NGO Monitor, I mean, the groups that get the most wrath are the ones that actually are the most effective and in some ways the most respected as well, mainstream, like Al-Haq. Ines, I want you to talk a little bit more, and I know this is something that's very specific, but I mean, can you talk more about where this fits in to the broader attacks that we've been seeing now for years on the legitimacy of work for human rights defenders, civil society, and what a lot of us in this space call the shrinking space for human rights defenders on Palestine?
Yes, as you said, I think these organizations are doing an immense job in trying to basically expose the reality and trying to condemn and in trying to have the international community react and hold Israel, but also the Palestinian Authority for its human rights violations to account. And what is happening, I think the Israeli authorities, it's very clear, it's been at play for several years now, through, whether it's through the Ministry of Strategic Affairs or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Ministry of Justice and all the authorities, and also related NGOs and lawfare groups outside, are trying to criminalize those groups. And I think the tactic is as follows. One is to silence them. Two, also to try and chill and kind of make sure that their international support, whether it's donors, funders, or supporters, are removing their support to them. And three, also, get these organizations to spend the energy in defending themselves instead of spending the energy where it's needed in trying to fight apartheid and trying to fight the occupation and trying to confront and document these violations. And I think it's unfortunately, I can say that partly it has been successful. We can see the chilling effect and the questioning from international supporters, but also the tremendous energy that needs to be spent. And these organizations, it's important to say, are not the first to be kind of categorized as terrorists under Israeli law. Like one of the recent ones is the Health Workers Committee. It's an NGO that's also quite prominent. Their director, Shada Ode, is currently under administrative detention, which is basically arbitrary detention where Israel just put you in jail for no reason, without charges. Some of the staff of the organizations that are now have been labeled today have been jailed. Some of their offices have been raided by the army and their assets seized and so on. So this has been ongoing, and it has been indeed, as you said, well documented, both from where are the sources of these attacks and what are the consequences and the impact on these NGOs. And unfortunately, this means that the space for Palestinian society, civil society, political fabric, social fabric to exist, and human rights defense to exist is tremendously under attack, and unfortunately has a wider, I think, political consequences on the reality.
Yeah, I mean, and what's also, I mean, what's striking, and I think that's very powerfully stated, that I want to, for people who are listening, I want to remind them that what this also does is it deflects from discussions about the facts that these organizations are raising. We saw this in Washington. It was a couple of years ago with Betty McCollum's bill on the rights of children, where rather than really deal with the facts that she was raising, it became an attack on the organizations that were involved, which I think was DCI, Palestine, and UNICEF. It's essentially this logical fallacy: we'll discredit the source, and then we won't be forced to deal with the facts that, frankly, you can't discredit because these are facts. Many of them facts that are, you know, you can trace them down to Israeli government statistics. It's not, this isn't made up. Sarit, I want to talk to you and ask you to talk. So Btselem came out with one of the first public responses to this announcement. I want you to talk us through that response, and we will put a link to it in this post. But it's an extraordinarily powerful statement, which I just want you to talk us through Btselem's approach in responding to this.
Yeah, so I mean, Btselem's response was that Israel's changed government's designation, change in inverted commas, unfortunately, of Palestinian human rights organizations as terror organizations is not merely declarative. It's an act characteristic of totalitarian regimes with the clear purpose of shutting down these organizations. And then we stated that war is not peace, ignorance is not strength, and the current Israeli government is not one of change, but rather of a continuation of the violent apartheid regime that's been in place for many years between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea. And then Btselem also added that it stands in solidarity with our Palestinian colleagues and is proud of our joint work over the years and is steadfast to continue to do so. Maybe this actually connects a little bit to what you said earlier about facts, Lara, because this whole Orwellian attitude about the reality is very much reflected in the attitude towards fact. There is an absolute rejection and denial of the basic facts as we all in the entire international community accept them regarding the occupation and regarding Israel's apartheid regime and what is happening under it. I mean, I think only this week we heard a denial of the Israeli ambassador in the UN, Gilad Erdan, of the mere existence of settler violence, which has been documented, immensely. I've been at Btselem for 17 years now, and there has not been probably a month in the first 10 years and not a week gone by in the last 7 years of my presence at the organization that I have not seen or published some sort of information about, credible, detailed information about settler violence that is backed, that is orchestrated, organized, assisted by the state. So the ability of Israel's ambassador to the UN to actually simply deny this fact, it connects directly to this whole notion of denying the occupation, right? Denying the work or the obligations of Israel. I mean, it's ridiculous to even begin to refer to these obligations. Clearly, Israel shirks them. And I think it's very important to have this approach. Now, I also should say that the Btselem is also focusing on the political context within Israel of this designation. We have members of Meretz and of Ram in our change government in the Israeli coalition. This has been, a focus of a lot of internal political debate on whether on the kind of change that this new government brought. And I think this clarifies again and again that the change is absolutely unrelated to anything to do with the occupation, right? The policies are the same people who have been implementing the policies are the same, except for now there's also a fig leaf in the form of our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Yair Lapid, who this week, as far as I understood it, told foreign diplomats during meetings that Israel will not build new settlements, right? Or that there was not going to be construction in settlements. Clearly, on the same week where Israel approves thousands of new settlement units. So this is, I think, an issue that we internally have to deal with, but that also the international community needs to be aware of. Finally, I think, and this is, I'm sure and absolutely certain that I'm not speaking only on behalf of myself or of Btselem, but also of our entire community, right? The community of human rights organizations in Israel, focusing on the occupation, of showing a really steadfast and clear messages of solidarity with these Palestinian organizations. For what it's worth, I mean, it's not a secret that our position within Israeli society is not exactly incredible currently, but I think showing the both the kind of like security establishment, but also the kind of organizations, the kind of occupation denial, apartheid denial organization like NGO Monitor, etc., that we are simply not cowed by their threats and accusations and guilt by association, smear campaigns as a community is very, very important. I think we've been under a lot of pressure for the last, God knows how many years, since about 2009 and beforehand, as a community, I mean, as Israeli human rights groups, but it's absolutely nothing, I mean, the level of risk that Palestinian human rights defenders are currently under is nowhere near what we as Israelis have to deal with. And I think that's also a very important dimension, right? We are extremely privileged in our current society, where we intend to use as much as we can to make our voice heard about this issue.
Thanks. And I will say I've been heartened this morning my time, seeing the responses from the Israeli human rights community and some in the US as well. Ines, I want you to talk a little bit from your perspective as a Palestinian about this broader context of, delegitimizing Palestinian voices. I've talked for years about what I call the pincer action between using the 6 degrees of terrorist contamination and false claims of anti-Semitism as sort of the, then you sort of manage to capture everything and try to kill everything with that. Can you talk more about these challenges? And if you want to even broaden out a little bit to the social media, what we're seeing with, the IRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition, this broader effort to effectively erase Palestinian perspectives from the narrative entirely.
Yes, I think.
By the way, along with Palestinian perspectives, facts and Palestinian perspectives.
Yeah, exactly. I think what's very exhausting for Palestinians, right, is to live, I think, this violence every day, right? To have to go through the permit regime, the wall, the violence of the army or the police, the subjugation, you're born unequal with unequal rights, all of this, you have to face this tremendous violence, but you have to face this violence and yet prove your humanity and try to convince people that you're human enough, that you deserve those rights, those fundamental rights, like any human being. And I think that's extremely exhausting, and unfortunately it's working, because all of what these attacks do, whether it's accusing of our friends of anti-Semitism or Palestinians of terrorism, etc., is exactly like those groups are doing, like narrative manipulation. They're using this psychological manipulation of gaslighting, like making you question, as Sarit said, it's very Orwellian. It's like this dystopian thing where you are your reality is questioned. And you have to, it's like, it's victim blaming. Like as a victim, you're asked to actually just question even your own perception of reality. And this is affecting the entire society. And it's very dangerous. And I would say the most disheartening is to see that the international community and governments are listening, right? And I think what we've seen is that, yes, we have seen some sort of support, but we also have seen definitely governments and politicians listening to NGO Monitor, listening and taking credibly all this information and these narratives. And that's what's very disheartening. And I think where, Palestinians would expect that people see behind this manipulation. And so I think, on the ground, the struggle continues. Like Palestinians still want their rights, still want to be free, but they have this additional layer of trying to convince that, their reality and the facts are not manipulated. And so, yes, I think that has been the case for criminalizing from the BDS movement to human rights defenders. And it's pretty wide in the society. And that means that Palestinians have lost some space. And, again, the Western powers and governments that have an impact, whether it's the US or Europe, that have an impact here on also the existence of these organizations that are under attack in Israel or from Israel. They also control, and the platforms on social media are there. They're in the US, and these platforms also use definitions of terrorism and of perceptions of certain words, or that are definitely from their perspective and with a very Western approach to this. So I would say that I think, as you said, I think if we take a step back, this is not only in Palestine, right? There is a trend also in authoritarian regimes these days to also use this gaslighting and manipulation of facts and truth, and so we're living that every day. And I think for me it all goes back to the impunity. Why does Israel today think on a Friday that they can do that? It's because of the impunity, because they entrench apartheid, they colonize more, they take more land, they take more of our rights. And, the international community says, fine, like we'll issue a few statements of condemnations, we'll say a few words that it's bad, that it's against international law and against human rights. But you know what? Continue to violate international law and human rights, you'll get away with it, and you'll get like peace agreements with your neighbors, and we'll make friends again with you. Don't worry about that. We'll continue to give you military aid and trade weapons. So, that impunity is what fuels further attacks and is the fuel that continues to, perpetuate the shrinking of our space.
Yeah, I mean, it's what you're saying about the gaslighting and also the victim blaming, because it's striking if you listen to we keep mentioning NGO Monitor. I should say to folks, I'm not going to put a link to NGO Monitor with this podcast, but if you want to check their website, what you'll see is that NGO Monitor, in effect, using the 6 degrees of terrorist contamination and claims that BDS is anti-Semitism and all that, effectively have deemed the entire Palestinian NGO human rights defender sector to be radioactive, and it's clear there is no Palestinian group that would be acceptable unless it's a group that actually becomes a Zionist organization and defends Israel from Palestinian protests. Then that would be an okay group. And the use of the terrorism claim here, I've talked about this in the past. Terrorism used to mean actually supporting, financing, inciting, committing violence against civilians. And then it became diplomatic terrorism. If you go to the UN, it's economic terrorism. If you boycott, it's journalistic terrorism. If you write articles. And now if you defend human rights, it's human rights defenders terrorism by making Israel uncomfortable and looking bad. But then that always allows Israel to say we are the victim of the horrible human rights defenders who are daring to talk about facts we don't want them to talk about. Ines, at the end of your last comment, you talked about the international community a little bit, and I want to zero in on that. There's an article the other day about Gaza, and we've talked about this amongst ourselves a lot. I think this idea that in some ways, intentionally or not, Gaza and the West Bank, or where Israel is in control over Palestinians, has become almost a laboratory for testing and perfecting illiberal policies, right? Illiberal policies that then have a kosher stamp of having come out of the strongest ally of the ally of the US and all that out of Israel. Like Israel's kosher stamp is on some really problematic illiberal policies. In terms of resisting this, what do you hope to see from the international community? This seems to now be a test, right? If for years it was, well, we know NGO Monitor is active in Brussels, we can, I know other groups are putting out competing reports and trying to compete for the narrative. Now we actually have a pass-fail test in terms of what people do to resist. Can you talk about what you hope to see or what you maybe expect to see, and really what the stakes are a little bit more for human rights defenders and for, particularly I'm thinking about Europe, but also the US. And Sarit, get ready, I'm coming to you next. Similar question.
A very short and simple answer is, we expect the US and European government to stop being complicit like to literally look inward into their policies, where their money goes, where their support goes, and trying to make sure that they don't support Israel's apartheid. And even if they don't want to recognize the reality that this is apartheid, just recognize that they've been violating international law and human rights for decades. And I think until impunity ends, nothing will change. And I think the way, obviously, for Palestinians to resist that, because we're not asking charity. It's not like for the international community to liberate the Palestinians, but at least don't be complicit in in cooperating and facilitating our oppressor. So I think it's give us our space, we want our agency, like Palestinians want their agency to decide. What's happening in Gaza is that it's an entire population, Palestinians in Gaza are denied an economy, they're denied dignity, they're denied life, they're denied the possibility to be with their peers, to be with other Palestinians elsewhere. And so the sense of connection. So years and years have also deeply affected Palestinian society, which is very fragmented. It's very, divided, it's broken. And, despite that, we managed to come with so much energy to speak out, uprise. But, should not be taken for granted, because often we're asked, so where's the political alternative? When are you going to have a new democratic government, or, and I'm like, well, do you see like every day what's like the obstacles that are being put to simply just speak, organize, document, and be together? How do you want to build like a sane civil society, a sane political space in there? So I think this is what we need from international community, is to really start questioning their relationship with Israel, with a regime that's effectively rogue and is violating all kinds of international standards. And we're not asking double standards, we're just asking that Israel is held to the same standards as others.
Yeah, I think that last point is key, because for years the answer has been, when we talk about, a lot of us talk about the problems inside with Israeli policy, people say, well, but you're holding Israel to a different higher standard. The answer is no. Israel is demanding to be held to a different lower standard, right? In the rest of the world, if you say you can't do human rights reporting, people say no, that's illiberal. I mean, Israel's insisting to be held to a lower standard than other countries that say that they're democratic and liberal. Sarit, we're gonna end. This is the last question. You guys, if you have any last words, you're certainly welcome to weigh in as a final thing. But I want you to weigh in on the same question, sort of what Europe and the US, in your view, should say, must say, if they care about the NGO sector at all. And I want to throw in, just as an aside, I think it was last year or the year before, we actually had one of the US pro-Israel lawfare organizations, this was during the end of the Trump era, actually raise a case with the US government demanding that Black Lives Matter be treated as a terrorist organization, because Black Lives Matter has ties to BDS, and then making this, again, 6 degrees of terrorist contamination, to actually go after a mainstream movement here in the US, right? So it's this kind of like the ball rolls down the hill and it gets bigger and bigger and captures more and more in it.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear historically that Israel didn't invent this tactic of smearing, your critics and discrediting them and labeling them terrorists. It's happened in the past, and certainly I think we could also learn from past experiences. But in any case, I want to connect to what Ines just said. Basically, I second the notion that dealing with this issue has or is part of the broader thing we expect from the international community, which is to deal with Israel's occupation and apartheid regime, right? So we've been saying a lot when having conversations about this, the shrinking space environment in our context, which is primarily Palestinian and also Israeli organizations being targeted, that what we expect is actually the international community removing the reasons for the existence of Israel's human rights groups that work on the occupation, right? Deal with the occupation, don't just give us the kind of like coverage of support, but certainly removing the underlying reasons why these kind of like Israeli occupation apologist groups are operating. They're silencing us because of, in order to perpetuate the occupation and the apartheid and the situation on the ground. So certainly the broader picture has to be in our minds constantly. However, I do have some specific comments on the issue itself, which is that I expect both the European Union and also the US government to make very clear statements rejecting this kind of terror labeling of human rights defenders by Israel. In terms of a statement, I think the statement should come both from the High Commissioner, Joseph Borrell, so from the European Union, and also from member states and those states affiliated or that have a like-minded attitude with the European Union. I should also say that in the past, my personal experience it was that the European Union is actually quite happy to support human rights defenders and is much more willing to put political capital, to spend political capital on defending us rather than, kind of like opposing Israeli policies that actually harm, Palestinians' rights and impose an occupation and apartheid regime on Palestinians. So let's see if even that basic request and expectation we have, which is a steadfast and a very clear rejection of this. Of these false accusations and of these actions needs to come from the highest levels of the EU, and I also would expect it to come from the highest levels of the US government. In the past, the previous High Representative did issue a rejection of one of the kind of previous incarnations of this, the terrorists in suits, or one of the Ministry of Strategic Affairs reports accusing Palestinian organizations of various accusations, but I think we're on a very, very different level now. It's not enough to simply send like an internal letter to Israel. This needs to be a public statement. So this is just on the very basic level. Beyond that, we expect actions to be taken by the European Union when it comes to all of these organizations that are partly funded by member states, by the Commission itself on in some specific aspects, and we would like to see a very clear commitment to continue this funding and to also making sure that the funding can actually be utilized by these organizations, because they're not going to be shut down or arrested. And then, again, I expect the diplomatic community, both diplomats based here in Israel, so in Tel Aviv, where I am, but also in Ramallah, so diplomats who represent their countries both with Israel and with the Palestinian Authority, to commit themselves to monitoring these actions, to opposing them, to being outspoken about their opposition, to allow Palestinian human rights defenders freedom of movement, freedom of association, basically, and to be willing to also deal with situations as they arise. So I would say those would be like basic responses to this specific action. It remains to be seen now what happens on the legal level. I mean, the Palestinian organizations have, an ostensive option to appeal this designation. We know that appealing anything against or doing any kind of legal work vis-a-vis the Israeli, the ISA, the Israeli Securities Agency, is not very beneficial or useful, but there's an option of doing that. There's also an option of a high court petition. But this, this remains to be seen. But I think that the essential thing is for a very, very swift and clear commitment on behalf of the European Union to not simply get carried into and follow blindly this smear campaign by Israel.
Thank you. Ines, did you want to add anything?
Maybe one last thing about, like, I really also, I hope that this whole, thing will not also lead the US or the European Union to also pick and choose, who has the right to be a human rights defender and who's not. Like, anyone who's a health worker, a farmer, an activist, they're all under attack and they all deserve protection. So I think also try and avoid, those labels of, oh, you're a human rights defender, so you have right for protection, but not the others. I think we should also make sure that this is avoided in the future.
I think that's very important. The thing that I keep repeating this, I'm going to repeat it one more time as we close, which is I think it is important that people understand when they look at this news and hear about it, is that the Israeli government is not alleging that any of these organizations are actually involved in, are supporting, are financing, are inciting, are engaging in terror. What they're doing is saying these organizations that do things that we don't like, we're going to give them a label based on a flimsy 6 degrees of separation, guilt by association approach. And we're going to say all of the facts that they say are no longer relevant because we've labeled them as such. And at the end of the day, what really is important here are those facts, which is what you're both saying, I think. This is the underlying problem here is not today's announcement. The underlying problem here is the human rights violations. And this announcement doesn't do anything to challenge that. And now, in a way, it's what Ines said at the beginning, this is very effectively going to suck a lot of energy and political capital away from drawing attention to and trying to end those human rights violations, to trying to defend the very ability to document and talk about those human rights violations, which is just enormously frustrating and infuriating. Sorry, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I'd want to add one thing that is also related, I think, to the bigger picture, which is that these are human rights organizations working in Ramallah or in Hebron, Nablus, Palestinian towns, obviously in Area C as well, but within Palestinian society. I should add that I think the Palestinian human rights sector is incredible, and the way that people are dealing with the difficulties of living under, both the PA and the Israeli occupation is just incredible. But these are Palestinians who ostensibly, supposedly, are under the control of the Palestinian Authority. So the fact that Israel can simply act in a way that will negate any kind of control, relevance that the Palestinian Authority has to the work of civil society in Palestine is quite indicative of the total Israeli control over the Palestinians that was just kind of exemplified this week when Israel decided to provide this wonderful, I'm being sarcastic, goodwill gesture and improve the status, the residency status of a few hundred Palestinians, and allow a few other 100 Palestinians to change their residency from Gaza to the West Bank. So, because Israel controls all of the Palestinian population registry. So this is just simply another example of how pervading and total Israeli control of Palestinians is. I mean, these Palestinian organizations work are controlled to some degree in a probably a problematic way, right? Or not controlled. I mean, have to deal with checks, with tests, operate within Palestinian Authority law, and that's just simply completely irrelevant when Israel decides to deal with, or to simply brush them aside and try and shut them down.
Thanks. All right, so this is so great. We're going to stop there. This has been amazing. I am so grateful for both of you for the work you do every day, and I'm personally grateful for you joining me again on incredibly short notice to deal with this alarming development. For our audience, thanks for listening and watching. I believe, will be doing a podcast next week on this same topic with some other experts, so keep an eye out for an announcement of that. And as always, I want to remind people to subscribe to the Occupied Thoughts podcast. You can do so on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Spotify. That way you won't miss any of the great content that we are posting constantly, because there's just so much to post about. And you can also find the podcast and a video of it on our website, www.fmep.org. And with that, we will sign off for this Friday, October 22nd. Thank you again, Sarit and Ines. I'm Lara Friedman, President of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, signing off until the next episode of Occupied Thoughts.
Thank you.